All right, thank you everybody for joining another Africa Oil and Power and Africa Energy Chamber webinar. We're very excited to have everybody. I'm just going to wait a couple moments as people are logging on, and then we'll get started.
Yeah. Hi, Maria.
Hey, Werner, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
Good. I'm glad I was able to log on time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Katie Hurst. I'm the Director of Programming for Africa Oil and Power. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today, brought to you by Africa Oil and Power and the African Energy Chamber. We're discussing the pathway to grid stability, increased capacity, and a diversified Angolan economy. We have with us Werner, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, guys, so just bear with me. We have Werner Akukebi, the Senior Vice President of the African Energy Chamber, who's gonna be my co-moderator today. I'm just gonna ask each of the panelists if you can take about 30 seconds to introduce yourself in just a moment. Real quickly, I'm gonna explain some housekeeping items to our audience. If everybody can look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box here. We really encourage you guys to interact with each other on this chat box. Please make sure the to is marked to all panelists and attendees so that you're speaking with other members of the audience. Feel free to engage on the discussion that we're having. There's also a Q&A box here. We encourage you guys to submit questions to our panelists. We'll be taking those questions throughout the webinar, and we really look forward to engaging with you on that platform. If everybody can just take a moment in the chat box and say your name, you know, where you're from, what company you're with, just to get that conversation started. And then if each of our panelists can take about 30 seconds to introduce yourself before we get started and pass it over to Werner. Maria, we'll start with you.
Okay, hi, my name is Maria Cruz, and I'm President and CEO of the U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce, and I'm so happy to be participating in this discussion, and the Chamber is also happy to be one of the partners on this discussion. The U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce has been promoting trade and investment for 30 years between the U.S. and Angola, and thankfully, I think through the investments done by U.S. companies in Angola, that indirectly we've contributed to not only the development of the Angolan people, but also the capacity building of Angolan people, but also the development of the Angolan economy. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Great, and then Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Guiado. I am the Foreign Service Officer with the United States Embassy in Luanda, Angola. I've been with the embassy for almost a year now, and I'm the Deputy Political Economic Chief in our section, and I also am our Energy Officer. So with largely a focus on oil and gas, but also the United States Embassy has a large program to support the power sector through our Power Africa program. And I'd like to speak a little bit about that today and share some of those developments. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Great, and then Federico.
Hello, my name is Federico Martins Correa. I am a Deloitte partner. I'm in charge for consultancy in energy resources and industrial sector for Angola, and co-leader also for Francophone African countries. I'm very happy to join you for this conversation. In Deloitte and myself, we are working with in the energy environment for the last 12 years and supporting several projects around power and also in oil and gas. In fact, we all are facing a critical moment, something that we have never faced before. So I'm very happy to take this hour to see what together we can do to lever the actual conditions of power sector in Angola for the next coming years. Very welcome to everyone.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it over to Werner to start our conversation.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Katie. And thank you everyone for being on the panel. I know these are difficult times with COVID and all whatnot, so it's a pleasure to have such an esteemed panel to be able to talk about energy issues in Angola. Now, not just Angola, but of course, the whole of Africa. Power is a particularly important topic because of the role that power plays in terms of the economies of all African countries. I would say also actually across the world. It is important to note that when you look at countries across the world, you look at countries like China, which have been able to, in a pretty short space of time, raise significant amounts of people out of poverty. You look at the US itself, or you look at Europe, there is one key item which all those economies were able to tackle, or one key problem, and that is access to affordable energy. I think it is important for African countries to be able to find a way to solve this particular dilemma. And Angola, in this particular case we're talking about, has actually at least recognized that issue. That is why the government of Angola has been able to, and we're going to hear a lot of that from people like Maria or Paul, but also Federico, who have been engaging in that particular sector. That is why the government of Angola has been able to challenge significant amount of resources over, I would say, the last decade actually, to make sure that, you know, the Angolan people can be provided with affordable energy. Most people always talk about, you know, you need an industrial base, and for you to be able to build a particularly good industrial base, you should be able to get access to significant amounts of affordable power. So without further ado, I'll start with Maria to give us a little bit of an insight in terms of why power is so important for the government of Angola, and why the government of Angola has been putting significant amount of resources in recent years with respect to providing power, at least creating the capacity to be able to provide power to its people.
Sure, thank you. I'll try my best to share what I do know, what the government of Angola has been doing to invest in the energy sector. Well, one thing for sure, I will piggyback on what you did say. You cannot build or expand the industrialization of the country without secure power throughout the country. And the government of Angola has invested what they call the Angola Energia 2025 agenda. And basically, you know, the agenda is robust. It's in order to invest in the energy sector. There's an estimate of around $23 billion that the government would like to invest in as part of this Angola Energia 2020 strategy. And the thing is, it's going to need support of the private sector. I'm just going to give you some quick figures as to how the private sector has, at least according to the Ministry of Energy and Water, has shown interest, particularly in the renewable energy sector. For example, in the renewable energy sector, they have a potential of 55 gigabytes in solar energy, 3 gigawatts in wind, and 18 gigawatts in hydro throughout the country. And this is according to what the Ministry of Energy has currently, and only supplies something like, of all its energy, 60% of it in the province of Luanda, and the remaining 40 in the rest of the country. Of course, with this agenda, the idea is to expand to all of the provinces, because currently, and let me say that, and for those who do not know, is the distribution company for the government of Angola, Empresa Nacional de Distribuição de Energia. And just to say that currently, energy costs are, the average cost is 0.05 kwanzas per kilowatt, which is roughly 2 cents per kilowatt, which only covers a third of the average cost of production cost, which is 15.81 kwanzas per kilowatt, which is 52 cents. So of course, N doesn't have the capacity to reinvest any sort of revenue that they have, because they don't, to expand its distribution throughout the country. So this is where the private sector can really play a key role.
Okay, thank you for that. Paul, I'll go to you and say, in that same light, you just told us that, you represent, or you work a lot together with Power Africa with respect to projects. Could you please give us an insight of your own view, looking at companies that are potentially playing in that market? We're talking here, of course, due to your position, to American companies that might have come. What is the level of interest that you are seeing from American companies into the Angolan power sector?
No, thank you for that, Werner. I think what's interesting, if I could, just to go back a bit and comment a bit on and add to Maria's comment, which I think is very interesting, is that I think the opportunities for American companies can be found throughout the various segments of the power sector. There are opportunities in generation, transmission, and distribution. I think what's really interesting about Angola, though, and I certainly look forward to discussing this further with panelists, and particularly Federico, your views on this. So I know we've had conversations about this before. One thing that's very positive about the Angolan market is the Angolan government, with multilateral donors and some bilateral donors, has really invested a lot in generation. And so there is a potential, as Maria had pointed out, the ministry's plan for electrification not only aims to go from 38% to around 60% by 2025, which I'm sure we'll discuss later whether that will be delayed, but also aims to go from around less than 3 gigawatts of installed generation to approximately 9 by the end of the period. So we don't know if they'll get there to 9, but Angola certainly, through the development of hydropower on the Kwanza River Basin, which we can discuss later, has a very strong base of generation sufficient to meet future demand, even projected out to 2030. And there are other opportunities in generation on, I would argue, on gas to power and particularly renewables in the solar sector. But the real place where I think right now you can see a lot of opportunities for investors are in transmission and distribution. I'll turn it over to my colleagues because I'd like to hear their views on that. But I see that as being a place for not only American investors, clearly, but other investors who are interested in Angola.
Thanks for that. I think it's quite interesting what you're bringing out in terms of when you look at the whole chain, one has to then be looking at where in particular the sector finds itself, to be able to say, in the past, might be these mega projects around building huge dams like Lauca was where you had the significant opportunities. But now it's moved on to transmission and distribution. And there we can start seeing significantly smaller players in that sense, in terms of doing portions of that kind of work. And this is where I want to bring in Federico. You have extensive experience in looking at companies who sometimes want to come into the sector from outside. What are the kind of, I don't want to put it as challenges, but what should people watch for when they're coming into the sector? We've now seen, that the opportunities are there. The government is eager to bring in a significant amount of investment from outside because, of course, Maria has just spoken. There is a significant amount of subsidizing which is going on, and that is not something which the government thinks is sustainable. So what are you seeing as the opportunities to coming in and being able to take some of those opportunities in the transmission and distribution space?
Okay, I think we just a brief step back that, and I think is important to share with our attendees that Angola did the sector unbundling in 2011. So comparing to several countries in Africa, and if we look more to sub-Saharan Africa, Angola has already clear view about what is generation, transmission, and distribution. And that enables that also during this program that has been done on that time called PTSE, so the transformation sector, the sector transformation for energy, also the law and the regulation has been improved to enable that private sector could come and join the sector. Actually, in terms of distribution, it is quite easy to create a company and be a player in distribution. In transmission, the vision is to provide more services or EPC contracts, not to be a player. Okay, so actually the central part of the sector, so the transmission, is handled by R&T, and the vision from the government to the country is to keep the transmission as a state-owned, at least for some couple of years from now, as a state-owned part of the value chain. Although in distribution, the government is very keen and looking for companies who would like to join Angola to create their own distribution companies locally. At the moment, the government, and based on the loans, some international investments, and also donors that have been contributed to the country, is being done a work to create a more stable transmission network, because we have a quite reasonable installed capacity to generate power, but unfortunately we have some lack of consistency how to transmit that power to where the demand are. And I see as a huge opportunities to international companies and to national companies to be part of the projects that are being done in transmission as service provider, as technical skills facilitators, as EPC main contract. If we are talking about a worldwide company, probably a subcontract if we are talking about a more regional company, because the level of investments required to play in are different, of course. But I'm also seeing several opportunities in terms of distribution to enable that national companies could create their business. Also, the commercial banks are being pushed and push and pull to supply credit to national companies to invest on distribution. And I see that if we look to some provinces that are pushing for agriculture, some of them, for example, for manufacturing. For example, if we look to the south of the country, we have a lot of investments being done in agriculture. We have some investments, relevant investments being done in fishing, and we have also relevant investments being done in manufacturing. So I would say that is quite interesting for private equities, national private equities or regional private equities, to look to the distribution part of the power value chain to see how could be the opportunities and how could handle that opportunities in the country. The ISEA, that stands for, in Portuguese, Instituto Regulador do Setor Elétrico. In English, is the regulator that is in charge for energy and water, has improved a lot their skills on the last 3-4 years. They have invested a lot in their people, and they are very keen to support the people who are seeking for opportunities in the distribution, to analyze and to contribute with data to start the feasibility studies and to see how could bring some profit for that companies, because of course we must have in mind that each company that will invest in distribution wants to have some profit from that, of course.
Thanks, Federico. Now, Maria, we're just hearing from Federico that some of the, governmental institutions involved have increased capacity in terms of being able to support market entry in that sense. What are you hearing from Angolan companies on the ground? Their ability to be able to attract partners, so what are they facing? What are they looking for in terms of in partners in that sense, so that some of our audience here who are potentially interested could know what to look out for when they're looking to come in with investments into the sector?
Sure. I think one of the main issues is information. There are two sort of funds that the World Bank is investing in the electrifying improvement as well as the African Development Bank, and both of those funds are for the government. But as part of these funds, the government seeks support from the private sector to support feasibility studies, support with know-how, etc. And what we found is that Angolan companies sometimes have difficulties in finding US companies who are interested in engaging the market. Sometimes it can be with the fact that there's past due information of what currently is taking place in Angola, and the improvements that have taken place in regards to investment in the sector. Others, it's of course, sometimes they consider it's a language barrier. Although in investment or in negotiating, Angolan companies usually do have someone who speaks English, but there's always that hesitation of, not knowing the language fully. But I think the main issue is information, being able to share information and knowing that what the opportunities are, and being able to reach out to companies who may be interested in investing in different sectors. I know the Ministry of Energy and Water, before this whole COVID situation, had discussed doing a conference similar to what AOP did for the petroleum ministry, in which it would provide an opportunity for investors to hear firsthand about the opportunities available in the sector. I do hope that even, post-COVID or even within COVID, maybe on the web, as it's been taking place in different countries and getting the word out, that they're able to create a platform in which people can come and learn more about the opportunities. There's still a level of bureaucracy that has improved, but still needs to be streamlined, and I think that's part of what we do at the Chamber, and make sure that we share with our partners in the government about ways in which certain policies can support more investment of US companies in the country.
Well, so people outside there and fellow investors who are out there, you're hearing the bureaucracy has been going down in Angola as something which people always are scared of. So if at all you are looking to, that is a positive sign. The government is also bending over backwards, is what I would say. Overall, doing business, Angola has improved. If you look at the ability to be able to set up a company now and fully own it from outside, I think those are important signs actually that you can actually come in and control your own investment and, you know, be able to engage in the sector. I think, Paul, and this is directed to you, it also goes the other way around. My current question would be, for a number of people in Angola, significant, you know, larger companies and even medium-sized companies who are saying, gee, you know, I read in the news that, you know, Power Africa is putting up a couple of billions of dollars into the power sector. How can companies in Angola practically tap in to this source of funds, Paul? You know, do they just come to the embassy and knock on your door and you're going to be spraying the dollars? Can you give us, you know, in a practical sense, how Angolan companies can go about engaging to be able to tap into the support and the funds that Power Africa has available for investment in energy? And this, of course, is going to help those in other countries that are looking at this and seeking to potentially tap into the resources which Power Africa has available.
Thanks for that, Werner. I think what's important for the group to note is something that both Maria and Federico mentioned, which is in Angola, and Power Africa has a different model in each market, in each country in which it operates, based upon market conditions, regulatory and legal policies, the framework of the government, et cetera. In Angola, what's interesting is that Power Africa has largely worked with our multilateral donor partners. And so what does that mean? Federico touched upon it, but the growth in generation in Angola, particularly in hydropower resources, it was largely supported by not only the government in Angola, but bilateral donors, lenders, etc. Where we see things going now at this stage of development, particularly with transmission and distribution, what we are doing is the model with Power Africa. We're partnering with the African Development Bank, and we are providing support for the African Development Bank and their more than $500 million ECIP loan package. What does that mean? What the African Development Bank approved in December of 2019 and is beginning to implement now, and again, Power Africa is supporting that, is a major transmission project, which is going to link the central and the southern grid of Angola, which are currently separate, which for the first time will provide for an interconnected national grid for north, central, and south in Angola. And we're also providing, assisting rather, AFDB in connecting prepaid meters, over 800,000 new prepaid meters throughout Angola, with the approximate goal of connecting approximately 400,000 new metered customers. In addition, Power Africa is providing technical support for both the transmission company, R&T, as Federico mentioned, Ende, the distribution company, and IRSEA, the regulatory agency. And so we're doing that in partnership with the African Development Bank and obviously the Angolan government. So what's the role of the private sector? And this is what's important. The question when you enter, if you're a company that's looking to enter the Angolan market, you're looking for finance, right? You're going to make sure that not only will you be able to have a return on investment, but that, that you have the ability to carry out your project and make a profit. Well, the positive note for both AFDB and World Bank is the finance essentially has been approved. Where will the private sector interact? The private sector will interact on some of the tenders that are forthcoming for these large projects. So in the case of AFDB, this transmission project, there will be tenders. In fact, there was just a tender launched for the first step of the transmission projects. This is more than 340 kilometer, 400 kilovolt transmission line, which will essentially connect, again, the central and the southern grid, terminating in Lubongo. And also there is now a tender that is out, if I'm not mistaken, for a resettlement plan for the creation, the building of that line. And there will be other tenders that will be launched over the course of this project over the next 4 years, perhaps 5. So these are the opportunities. We in the U.S. Embassy will partner with our private sector colleagues, certainly Maria and the Chamber. We'll partner with our Foreign Commercial Service. We'll partner with USAID. We'll partner with private sector to get the tender opportunities out to the market, and then to explain what that means. And so I see a real opportunity for companies to come into Angola and compete for those tenders over the next several years.
Paul, I also wanted to know, or I guess to say, couldn't U.S. companies also engage the funding through U.S. Development Finance Corporation, former OPIC? Don't they have funding for energy sector, which I also, let me add, that's $60 billion that USDFC has for investment on the African continent, which I haven't seen many US companies engage that fund for Angola. So that's also another opportunity for US companies who wish to invest in the market, I think.
No, that's correct, Maria, and thank you for bringing that up, because I think that as we move forward with the Development Finance Corporation, which is a relatively new entity under the BUILD Act, which is signed into law by President Trump, which essentially enables the US government to take both a debt and equity position in projects. And so that portfolio will really enable companies that are, again, looking specifically at Angola to turn to DFC to finance particular segments of those projects that they're looking to compete in, particularly the tenders for distribution and transmission. So thank you for bringing that up. And that's where we're happy to provide more information in the embassy to anybody who's interested in more.
Great, very much. So I'm going to hop in. We're getting quite a few questions from the audience. And very quickly, I'm just going to share, we took a poll. Where do you see the most opportunities for private investment in the Angolan power sector? 56% of respondents said generation, 18% said transmission, and 26% said distribution, which is a pretty interesting result. And Sergio is asking, Angola has a lot of power generation in place, enough even to power all its neighbors. The biggest opportunity is in distribution and end user. What can the US offer in terms of investment and expertise and legislation to support and unlock the massive opportunities? And just to add on that, I'd like to ask, if distribution, if we're seeing a lot of opportunities in distribution, and that's where a big gap is, what are some of the challenges to unlock the distribution side? And what opportunities do you see for private companies in that space specifically? Maybe we can start with Paul.
Sure, I think I'd be remiss not only to emphasize yet again the opportunities that are coming up under the African Development Bank's project, because I think that this ECIP loan is really it's not just the installation of meters, but the technical assistance that's being provided through Power Africa and our partners to the Angolan regulatory agencies and distribution entity ENDE. The idea is to enable not only opportunities for private sector actors to come in and compete for these tenders using standards that are globally recognized throughout the European Union, throughout Asia, throughout North America, throughout Latin America. So these are global standards to increase the caliber of the standards so that companies can come and know what they're competing for, that there's finance available through the DFC, and also to say, as I see it, that we're building or helping to build the financial and kind of fiscal resiliency of these Angolan entities so they can capture revenue. That's the whole point, to build the sustainability of these entities so they can capture increased revenue as the Angolan grid expands. I'd be curious for Frederico's thoughts on this, because I know that you have very deep knowledge in this, Frederico, and thinking of how both the private sector can not only invest, but then help kind of build that longer term sustainability for the sector through those investments.
I think there are two levels. I would say that in terms of transmission, it is very interesting that the companies are keen to to come to Angola and to play a role as during the APC. And for that, I would say that probably a sign of comfort that they could have is to get in touch, for example, with the chamber, also with you, because even for smaller companies, if they have the capacity to deliver properly with high standards, if they have the capacity and they are keen to engage some local staff. And I think that is an important point, because at least myself personally, but I think all the people that are engaged here, we are very interested that the Angolan people also have their opportunities. So I would say that in terms of project execution and to build infrastructure, the transmissions will have for the next 5 years huge projects, and there is not such big risk to join that market, because as you just said, the lenders are there, the donors are there, the budget will be properly managed by the ADB, so the consistency of the program in terms of infrastructure building is quite reasonable, satisfied, and so the companies could join the market for that. In terms of distribution, it's slightly different, because the projects are not so huge. So I would say that the challenge and the opportunities itself is to create companies that could distribute energy and make some profit from that. For that, I think it's very important that the companies that join the market start to look where are the key projects of economy diversification are being done. So look where we have opportunities around manufacturing, around agriculture, and try to create conditions to be a player in a certain area that enables that the level of demand will grant clients to their companies. And for that, I think they should get in touch with the regulator to understand what are the key points that they should grant as a company, and of course to balance also what are the rights and they will have and what they could achieve in terms of financing. The local banks and also the BDA, not ADB, so we have African Development Bank that are managing these huge projects, you can call it like that. But BDA, the Banco de Desenvolvimento Angolano, so the Angolan Bank for Development, have in their budget and their strategy the vision to enable a better distribution of power in Angola. And moreover, aside of Luanda province, and that is a key point, because the people and investors, and even Angolan people, myself as a player in the market, we should keep in mind that Angola is more than Luanda, and probably some of the most interesting opportunities we are having now to join the market and to have a 5 to 10, 15 year strategy to create the solid companies are in provinces that are not Luanda. So I would say that that should be the focus and the contribution of the of the private sector in the power sector, is to look to opportunities as a player in EPC for transmission, and be a player as distributors in provinces that are not Luanda.
Federico, let me just pick it up from where you were saying. I maybe ask you this, and then Maria can also chip into that. Angola is not just Luanda, is a good statement I'd like to pick. I know that last year, ENI signed a couple of deals around solar generation in Namibia province. Can you shed some light with respect to the opportunities for renewables? I mean, in Angola, with respect to, we have spoken about hydro already, but Paul had mentioned gas to power and some of the renewable opportunities. What do you see in terms of these opportunities manifesting themselves and becoming actually quite profitable for those who invest in? So we're talking here specifically about renewables, wind, solar, and also other forms of renewable, which there might be.
It's a good point, Bernard. I think there are several opportunities in solar and wind. The south part of the country is very windy, and for curious, even the solar, when we do a feasibility study around solar, Luanda province is not the best one at all, because Luanda is a bit cloudy. In the big chunk of the period of the year is cloudy, so it is easier and easier to have a more solid feasibility study if we look, for example, Kwanza Sul, if we look to Namib, but also in that regions is very windy. There are some projects around fishery in the south that could be solid clients to windy demand, and that brings another topic, that is probably to have some isolate projects around that. So what I see is, for example, to create infrastructure of wind that has some infrastructures that will require power supply for fishery transformation for wheat of fish, to a terminal, for example, to support, if we have, for example, the Lobito refinery, to support some other infrastructures that will be built aside. So in terms of windy, I see several opportunities, at least in the south of the country. In terms of solar, I also see quite interesting opportunities in the center of the country, because, for example, Wambu region, there are a lot of new agriculture projects that could be easily supplied by solar generation, and immediately jump from generation to distribution, avoiding the requirement of the national transmission grid. So that is also a very interesting opportunity that could be seen. The level of investment is a bit high, okay, is a bit high. Probably is something that for a private sector, national private sector, it will be a bit tough. But once again, BDA has conditions to analyze that project, projects, and also for a very solid projects, the international banks are keen to invest, because the assets itself, at least, are there to create external confidence to the investors. So in terms of solar and wind, it is a very interesting perspective coming on.
So Maria, we at the Chamber get a lot of requests with respect to some of these kinds of smaller projects around solar and around renewables. And one of the things, of course, which investors are looking for when they're coming in is the levels of comfort which the government is willing to give. No doubt the government has put a lot of money in hydro power generation, but are there any kinds of special measures to be able to entice investors who are looking at renewables specifically in Angola?
No, there are. Through IPEX in some sectors of the country, you have certain fiscal incentives for investing in certain sectors in those regions. So that also does help as far as reducing the your investment. And also, as Federico mentioned, there are several opportunities in solar, wind, and with what Paul said, with the ADB funding, several tenders in which companies can participate in. But one thing I would like to stress, and I think you mentioned it, Werner, is the fact that they can come and invest without necessarily having a local partner. However, I always do think it's important to have someone locally who knows the lay of the land to be a partner in these sort of partnerships. However, it's not required. And I also want to go back to, as far as opportunity, I think distribution is key, because one of the issues that END has is the fact that a lot of times they don't have metered accountability of the electricity it's providing, and as well as the intake or the financing for that is reduced. So having companies who have specific experience in the distribution area, like companies in the US, would be key. Would be really key in order to making sure not only after the infrastructure is built, transmission is guaranteed, that they're able to account for the distribution that they're providing to the population, so that it's not losing money as currently it is now.
Thank you, Maria, for that. So anybody in the audience who has significant interest and experience in distribution, please feel free to contact Africa Oil and Power, or feel free to contact the Chamber. And we are willing to help and to connect you to whoever you need to speak to in Angola to that respect. Now, Paul, I'd like to turn to you to gas, with respect to gas to power. This is one topic which is extremely close to my heart. Angola has significant amounts of hydrocarbons as resources, which are already being exploited. Second highest producer of oil in the continent. It's for certain that significant quantities of gas also. There's already LNG exportation, which is going out from Angola. How can Angola tap into the US gas to power technology and gas to power companies? It's worth bearing in mind that the US has been a leader in this and has been able to meet its I think Paris climate change targets quicker than anybody would have thought, despite not signing on. And one of the reasons for that is actually gas to power. There's been a significant push from gas to power in the US. And one thing which I think countries like Angola need to take advantage of is gas to power, given that they already have the gas resources in place. So my question to you, Paul, is how do we get American companies who already have a proven experience in gas to power to come and be players in the Angolan power play?
That's a very interesting question there, Werner. I think that Angola actually has fantastic opportunity with some very low-hanging fruit. And I know I don't want to deviate too far into hydrocarbons when we're here to talk about the power sector, but this is where the two areas of power sector and oil and gas sectors converge. And I think that the area of great opportunity is in fuel switching. Because as Federico and Maria had mentioned, Angola is not Luanda. And when you look at the 17 provinces outside of Luanda, you see that in many cases, regional capitals or in provincial capitals, those kind of, I would argue, are almost mini grids, are operated largely by diesel fire generation. Particularly in the eastern provinces, which have not been connected to the national grid. And that power is generated at a very high cost by diesel power generation to this day. There are certain logistical challenges to providing gas-fired generation, particularly in Luanda's east. But in the south, and in the central regions, particularly provinces of the country, and particularly those provinces and those diesel fire generation facilities that are providing power that on the coast, and I'm thinking particularly in Benguela province, I'm thinking in the south, perhaps Namib and others, you can look at opportunities and see opportunities. The policy has to be right. And this is an area where we're working with the Angolan government to explain how the policy needs to be crafted in such a way so that way investors have certainty of their investment and certainly the ability to make a profit. But there is no technological barrier. There's no barrier in regards to supply. I think that there are certain hurdles that can be overcome with logistics, but the policy has to be right, Werner. And not quite there yet, but we're having those discussions now.
Okay, good.
Perfect. So I'm going to jump in. We're getting some more questions from the audience. And on this topic of gas to power, Lewis is asking, we are a small scale LNG supplier that would like to set up in Angola to support the gas to power program. Who do we align with re gas supply and gas delivery? So I'd like to ask more on, like, in terms of entering the Angolan market. We also had a question, saying it's very difficult to start a business in Angola. My question goes to Federico and Maria. What sources of information can they turn to? So when we're talking about companies that want to enter the market, be it this LNG supplier, what are the sources of information? Who do they turn to? Who are their contacts? Maria, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think it's much easier now to create a business in Angola than it has been in the past. IPEX is their investment arm, where you can literally let's say their theme, but their slogan is, holding the hand of the investor from beginning to end. And experience, at least recently, with two U.S. companies have been very, very positive in regards to the process of starting a business. I think the part that slows down the process, actually, in my experience, has tended to be the banks, the local banks, opening an account. But as far as creating your company in Angola, that process has reduced significantly. And even if you don't want to go through IPEX and you'd like to go through a law firm, but as I said, you don't necessarily need a law firm to do it, but it does help. But IPEX has been, it's been a great means of doing that. And we at the U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce also do help our members through the process of investing and supporting their creating their entity in country. But it has the bureaucracy of establishing a company in the country has reduced. Though I will state that I don't know what it's like at the other parts of the country, but as far as creating a company in Luanda, the process has very much so been streamlined. I don't know if Federico agrees with me or not, but I find that it is.
For sure. Today, of course, because of my business responsibilities, I'm pretty close to that reality. And today, to create a company with the guichet único, for example, that is the cabinet that facilitates the process, it is working very well. Another thing that I think is important to stamp here is, in the past, to create a company, it was always required to have a national party engaged. Today, with the IPEX, as you said, and very well, it's not required anymore. And I think that is a stamp and a proven that the country itself is doing their route to open the economy and to attract investment. Of course, that the things are being quite difficult because all these steps are being done in a moment that globally the things are difficult. And that is very important to understand, that there are really important steps that have been done by the country and the government now that are not bringing the results that all of us expect, because we have faced another crude oil downturn. Today is less than $40 in the international market. We have COVID struggling with the trips, with the business affairs. So of course, that the external conditions and global conditions that we are facing, not only in Angola, but because are global, but have created a step back on the journey that the government was trying to do. Regarding the local banks, I think that they are trying to do an effort to contribute to at least to the distribution. And I've had the opportunity to join Werner a couple of weeks ago in oil and gas conference, and then all that time I've pointed that the local banks were keen to invest in distribution of derivatives for power gas stations, and is exactly the same perspective that is being applied by the local banks to the distribution sector in terms of power. Of course, when we are looking to the transmission itself subsector, it's quite hard to a local bank to afford that level of investment. But when we are looking to lower than 10,000 volts, so for distribution subsector, I think the local banks also have at least the capacity now to analyze the projects and try to handle it according to their conditions.
I agree with you, and actually I think also a good thing to point out is that I think in the past, at least for US companies wanting to invest in the country, they would often go to a bank, and even the international department didn't have anyone that spoke English, so which made it difficult. And now you don't find that, and also the fact that in the past you couldn't even find, some banks didn't even have a compliance department, but now, you know, all banks, at least, the ones that work with us, have a compliance department and are actively complying with international standards for finance. So just to add that note, not to say that the local banks aren't doing their part or don't have the capacity. So just wanted to make that note.
Perfect. So I'm going to switch topics a little bit. We're getting several questions on the issue of government subsidies. Hildo says he's been working with U.S. potential investors, and one of the main concerns is that is how to recover investments when government subsidizes more than 70% of total costs. Alex is asking about a similar thing in terms of, the rural areas in Angola. And I think Sergio maybe summed it up best. He asked, can someone comment on power pricing in Angola and what reforms can help attract more local and international investment? Paul, do you want to touch on this one?
You certainly passed the easy question to me, Katie. I think this is a very complex question. I see Federico and Maria laugh because it's true. Power pricing in Angola power pricing anywhere in the world is complicated. It's complicated in the United States. It's complicated in Europe. It's complicated in Asia. There's no place in the world where power pricing is an easy topic. One thing that I think that investors should take a look at, and I don't think we quite touched upon this, but if I'm looking at, if I'm a distribution company, right now, I agree with Federico. There will be opportunities to work with ENDE, and the legislation, the unbundling of the sector provided those openings. In the short to medium term, I think the reality is that you've got large multilateral donors, and I'm thinking of particularly the AFDB, which we've talked about, and as Maria had mentioned, World Bank, World Bank has not completed their or approved their large loan program to support both transmission and distribution in Angola, although we forecast that will happen. And pre-COVID, we expected a decision to have been made in July of this year. Possibly that will be pushed into 2021. And that's going to be another very large program. I can't speak to how large, but certainly we believe in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And if I'm a supplier to a distribution company, so for instance, I'm looking at EPC contracts for smart metering, for equipment, for engineering services, for environmental licensing. Those are the kind of companies that I think can enter the market now, take advantage of that structure that Federico so accurately and ably explained, to say you have multilateral donors, you have finance in place, you have global standards, and they're all working with the Angolan government towards a strategic objective. As these tenders come out, particularly when I look at smart metering, these EPC contracts, and possibly off-grid opportunities in provinces, particularly in Angola's east, I think that's where the big opportunities will be in the short to medium term. But I'm curious from a panelist's views on that.
Federico, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought there was going to be discussion. I thought that the whole reason for, I think you mentioned Eurasia, the body that that assess the regulator is supposed to look at or assess the possibility of some sort of fuel subsidy reform, and sort of identify a new sort of tariff system. I don't know if that's still in place, if it's still ongoing, if there's any new updates on that, but I thought that was one of the things that they were looking at, given the fact, as I mentioned at the beginning, what the cost per watt is not at all the average tariff that the country is charging people. So.
Yes, as far as I know, the studies are being done around that topic. As Paul said, it's very critical to touch on power price, because it's a foundation. And anytime we have to touch in foundations is very hard, not only in Angola, but in every place around the world. At the moment, we must be a bit
Hey, Francisco,
Now that
oh, there we go. I was gonna say, I think you were blocking your mic. We couldn't hear you very well, but it's better now.
at the moment, of course, the studies are being done, but we should also keep in mind that is a critical moment to the country in terms of economy diversification. So I don't see a ramp up immediately in terms of price. Due the population are also suffering with the impacts of COVID, and so the government and the IRSEA, of course, is doing that work, is trying to equalize what can be affordable by the society, and also to enable that the companies who are joining the sector could have at least a solid feasibility study, because of course without a solid feasibility study, not even local banks or international banks will provide any loan. But once again, the situation actually in terms globally is quite hard. So I would say that to have a new publishment on that topic, I don't see to have it immediately right now, but I know that IRSEA is doing a huge effort to create conditions that the private investment could come to the sector as soon as possible, without create impacts on the other sectors, to don't create a step back on the economy diversification that is going on, and of course don't create an extra effort to society, because of course due this COVID's impact is already suffering a bit.
I'd like to take the discussion a little bit to the opportunities around exporting energy. Now, we have already spoken about Angola's ability to generate. There is significant investment that has gone into the hydro side of things. We're also seeing a significant opportunity in the gas to power side, which would also be around generation. Paul, I don't know if these are discussions which you might have seen with respect to you engaging the market. But of course, it's worth noting that you have the DRC, which is not far from Angola. You have Zambia with a lot of copper, where there's a significant amount of demand. You have Zimbabwe, which is also not far, where there's significant amount of demand for electricity. And these countries, unfortunately, do not have the capacity or the ability, at least in recent times, to generate the energy that they need. So do we kind of foresee opportunities stemming out of there, if at all we get the right kind of investment in transmission, of course, for Angola to be able to earn much more hard currency from the exportation of energy? I know that, of course, there needs to be other discussions around tariffs, around what you sell, or putting in the right infrastructure. But long-term or mid-term, I would say, where do you see those kinds of discussions going?
No, that's a very, I think the concept of Angola power exports is very interesting, because it is baked into the design of the ministry's strategic long-term plan. And it's also central to large multilateral donors and Power Africa's assistance to the Angolan government. And so what do I mean by that? The Power Africa project that I had mentioned, in which we're supporting the African Development Bank and working alongside our Angolan counterparts, is meant to link the three grids, main grids, north, central, and south, for the first time in Angola. And there are other donors that I won't mention now, but we know in conversations with both African Development Bank and other development partners that are looking to, once that the three grids are connected, to then complete the connection to the Namibian border with a separate hydropower project there, and ultimately connect Angola for the first time to the Southern Africa power pool. That would take place sometime in the mid-2020s. That could be delayed because of COVID, at least in perhaps a year or two, but we're not looking at 10 years from now. We're saying that by the mid-2020s, this project, the interconnection of the three grids will occur. At that point, then you're going to have another project that will look to interconnect, again, Angola to the Southern Africa power pool. And there are feasibility studies and assistance also that's being helped by the US government in partnership with Deloitte, with other partners, with the Angolan government, Congo, DRC, to look at the interconnection with the Central African power pool. So these are not pipe dreams. These are things that the Angolan government is actively looking towards, Werner, to say over the next 10 years, where will Angola be in 2030 in terms of the ability to bring excess power to market and to draw hard currency to benefit the Angolan people and the Angolan budget. And we think that given the alignment of donor countries and international multilateral banks finance, plus the strategic vision of the Angolan government, it's not going to happen without challenges, but I think we'll get there. When you look at, one thing I'll just want to mention before I close, when you look at not only existing Angolan power demand, but even in the most optimistic scenarios in terms of industrial development, agricultural development, power diverted, as Federico had mentioned, say mining, large-scale mining projects in say Lunda Norte, et cetera. If you look at long-term power demand and forecasts, and then you look at power generation, just from the Kwanza River Basin alone, Angola could realistically have more than 2 gigawatts of power to export to both the Southern Africa power pool and the Central Africa power pool. I don't think that's a fantasy. That there's going to be a tremendous amount of excess power, and the question is going to be to get it to market and how Angola can do that.
Thank you very much for what was very insightful in terms of looking at midterm and long term with respect to pushing power beyond Angola's borders that originates out of Angola. I mean, when we look at the making Africa a single market initiative and all the trade agreements that were done, I think this is one of the things which some of those multilateral organizations are looking to sort of push. And we are excited at seeing how this actually manifests and realizes itself. I'll let the panel go around, and give a final closing statement in terms of where you see things moving forward. It's worth bearing in mind that since 2014, Angola, like every other country which has been significantly dependent on oil revenue for resources, has had to re-strategize, reorganize, and to reprioritize. But one thing that I seem to be able to see is that despite these difficulties, budgetary difficulties, the government is still looking to invest and keep its commitment to not only provide power to Angolan citizens, but to provide affordable power. And so, Maria, would you give us a final word on that and where you see this going forward? But also, tell us what investors can expect. Some of our members have been asking a lot about investing in Angola, and what is one thing you would like to have them take away from this discussion?
One thing I want them to take away from discussion is that Angola is a fairly new country, given the fact that this year it's going to celebrate 45 years of independence. There are industries here that are still not created. As was mentioned by my other fellow panelists, yes, there are opportunities with these different tenders and investing in the energy sector. But as I mentioned, there are industries here that are still not created. I think the land mass of Angola is something like 1.6 million or something like that, but less of which 49 or 50% of it is used for agriculture, but less than 12 or something percent is tapped. So there's opportunities there. There's opportunity for industrialization, but of course that requires the investment that is already starting to take place in the country. But also another key thing is that there's a true commitment by the government of Angola to invest, to provide key reforms to attract private investment and foreign direct investment to the country. And those companies that invest in the market during this time where things are still kind of settling will be better placed once the dust has finally settled. So I think this is an opportunity for companies here in the country and outside of the country. I mean, I know it's difficult right now with COVID for everyone. And I'd like to add though, here in Angola, with almost 30 million people, less than 200 cases, no more there, and less than 4% of deaths. So in regards to handling of COVID, Angola has done a great job in that regard. And that once post-COVID, when the market is open, I really do hope to see more U.S. companies engaging in the country, because when you engage in the country with U.S. The way business is done, transparency, supporting stronger institutions, good governance, it will support Angola's development. And not only that, when U.S. companies come to the country, they invest in human capital, which is also key to building capacity in the country and moving forward Angola's development and diversification of its economy. So come to Angola. The U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce is here to help and support, as well as the U.S. Embassy, they have a great commercial service, and Paul, of course, will add on to what they do. And then also our partners with the African Chamber can also support. So with that, I think I'll leave it there. But just to know, those who haven't been to Angola or who were in Angola in the past, I want you to take a new look at Angola and see that things are moving forward, and be part of the dialogue to push the meter forward, or push the ball forward. So thank you.
Federico, last word from where you sit.
It's a moment to give a sign of confidence for the work being done by the government. One thing that I've learned also from the COVID, to give you an idea, people here know that I'm consultants. I didn't have stopped any project during the COVID because we have local people, for example, within our company, doing their work properly. We have several local national people working with us, doing roads very properly. That I would say that 10 years ago it was quite impossible. I also deliver classes in the university in Angola, and the level of education has improved. So the
Sorry, Frederick, I think maybe your arm or your hands are on your keyboard or on your mic, because sometimes we can hear you really well and sometimes you sound kind of far away.
I don't know if it is for network, sorry. But just to close it, was to say that the level of education has improved a lot over the last years. The level of commitment of the in terms of employees to their business and to make it happen has also improved. And the government, in a very, very hard moment, global, is trying to keep the things going on. So I think it's a moment get from these capital conditions the opportunity to create some interesting business for the future.
Okay, I think Paul, you're last in terms of final takeaways and what you think is in store for those who take the punts and go make some money in the energy sector in Angola.
Great. Well, final thoughts. Just wanted to say thanks to the organizers for hosting a wonderful panel, and it's really a pleasure to join such esteemed colleagues and friends today. The one thing I'd like to take away is just to reiterate, in right now in Angola, you have I would say, an alignment of bilateral partners and friends of Angola, including the United States and many other partners and friends who have been in the Angolan market and have supported the Angolan government on the development of the power sector. You have multilateral development banks, you have private banks, and all of these players are working in concert with the Angolan government to develop a stable and resilient power sector. And the place where private sector investors can make money, where I would say to really keep your eye on, or take a look at these tenders that are being issued now. Again, for instance, the AFDB just released 2. And so take a look at these and the opportunities for transmission and distribution. And then I think that will provide an entree. If you're not present in Angola, it's a wonderful opportunity to enter the market, to reach out to people like Maria, Frederico, myself, colleagues in the embassy, to help you navigate that. We're all here to do that. But to understand that when you have these tenders in transmission and distribution, that's a wonderful way to come into this market and to really realize the opportunities over the short, medium, and long term in Angola. That's what we're trying to do in Power Africa, to really support the Angola government's strategic goals and to provide more access to power to the Angolan people. So we see a lot of opportunities in Angola, and I think Angola has a bright future in their power sector.
Well, let me just say thank you, guys. I also think Angola offers tremendous opportunities to be able to take advantage of. I think people need to go to Angola, go to Luanda, look at some of these opportunities. The time where you would listen to things on the internet and whatever, good and fine to do your research, but you need to go down there, speak to people like Paul, Federico, Maria, myself, Katie, and make sure that you do your due diligence and the opportunities are there to be taken. And huge profits are there to be made. So please feel free to call in the chamber if at all you need any help. I'll pass over now to Katie to sort of do the closing remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. Thank you to the African Energy Chamber for partnering with us. Thank you for our very great panelists. It was a really good discussion. Be sure and follow aopwebinars.com for upcoming webinars, and we look forward to seeing everybody hopefully in person soon. Thank you so much, everybody.